Okay, this is part 2 of chapter 21, Blood Vessels and Circulation. I'm going a little out of order in the book because I think it makes sense once you've looked at how blood pressure is to look next at how it's regulated. So we're going to look at cardiovascular regulation now. And remember, the big idea is that blood has to flow, okay? So whatever we're going to do is we're going to get the blood to flow where we need it, as much as we need it, and without disturbing flow to other organs. All right, so here's a term you need to know, vasomotion. Vasomotion is specifically a contraction and relaxation cycle of just the precapillary sphincters. This gets so confusing because vasomotion can also be used to talk about controlling blood flow to different organs, and we use the term vasomotor to talk about regulating the vessels. In fact, the center in the medulla that regulates the vessels is called the vasomotor center. So when we talk about cardiovascular regulation, we're going to talk about 3 different mechanisms to regulate blood pressure. Remember, if we can regulate blood pressure, we can keep the blood flowing. So autoregulation is also called intrinsic because it is within the nature or character of the local tissues to control it. We also have 2 extrinsic mechanisms, neural mechanisms. Remember, that's going to be the sympathetic nervous system, and then endocrine mechanisms, which your book says is long-term, but long-term is just a matter of minutes rather than the milliseconds of a neural response. These figures to me are kind of busy. I'm going to suggest that you take the time to look at them, make sure they make sense to you. For now, we're just going to look at certain parts. So start with the stimulus. And the stimulus is always going to be some disturbance of homeostasis. It could be changes in the chemistry of the blood due to increased activity alone could deplete the oxygen and increase the CO2 or change the pH. It could be stress, it could be trauma, it could be damage, it could be inflammation. A lot of different things are going to send signals to increase the blood flow locally. And that's going to affect those precapillary sphincters, which, again, I'm assigning you to learn the structure of the vessels. And so those precapillary sphincters control flow through individual capillaries, and so they're in control of vasomotion, that opening or closing of the precapillary sphincters. Basically, it's very simple. When a tissue needs more blood, the precapillary sphincters open, and when a tissue is fine, it's flush with all the oxygen, it's gotten rid of its waste, then the precapillary sphincters will close. So it's those local factors themselves that cause the opening and closing of the precapillary sphincters, and that's then going to regulate blood flow. All right, so the nervous system and the endocrine system are going to work mostly on either the blood vessels or on the kidneys. Now, you may wonder why the kidneys, and the answer to that is the kidneys are going to be in charge of urine production. So if you want to hold on to more blood volume and thereby have greater blood pressure, then you tell the kidneys not to lose very much water. This is called renal control of regulation through regulating blood volume, and it's slow and long term. It can take hours before the kidneys can cause much of a change. The neural mechanisms are going to include mostly the vasomotor center, stimulating the constriction or dilation of blood vessels, but also control of the heart, which we've already studied. So we're not going to focus in this chapter on what the heart does. We've already done that. So you just need to be aware of increased or decreased cardiac output and its factors, but we're going to focus mostly on peripheral resistance, vasoconstriction or vasodilation to increase or decrease blood pressure. All right, so we'll start with autoregulation. Autoregulation occurs when the local precap sphincters are stimulated to constrict or dilate, but it can also affect the arterioles. So local vasoconstrictors are going to decrease blood flow, not just by constricting precap sphincters, but also by constricting the supplying arterioles. Examples of these, endothelins are chemicals secreted by the endothelial cells, as the name tells you, that can stimulate contraction of local smooth muscle. That's going to constrict the arterioles and close the precapillary sphincters. Vasodilators are things that are going to open precapillary sphincters and dilate the local arterioles and increase blood flow. And here's a list of things that should all make sense. These all relate to either inflammation or just high metabolism. So if your muscles are very active, you're going to deplete the oxygen. CO2 is going to rise. If you do anaerobic exercise, you're going to get lactic acid. Nitric oxide is actually a specific signal that's released. And then elevated local temperature from higher metabolism. It should make sense to you that all of these things are going to increase blood flow to metabolically active tissues. The neuromechanisms, the main one, the cardiovascular center, is the cardiac centers. That's, remember from last chapter, cardioacceleratory and cardioinhibitory. And the vasomotor center. So when you need to boost blood pressure, you stimulate the cardioacceleratory center. When you need blood pressure to drop, you're going to stimulate the cardioinhibitory center. And of course, the vasomotor center is going to cause vasoconstriction through sympathetic nerves. The adrenergic nerves secrete norepinephrine. And then the ones that it's going to dilate are controlled by cholinergic nerves. These cholinergic nerves secrete acetylcholine, but acetylcholine, through a couple of steps, activates the secretion of that nitric oxide that we saw earlier, and that causes vasodilation. By the way, nitric oxide mechanisms are the same mechanisms that are used in heart patients who take nitroglycerin tablets. It stimulates the secretion of nitric oxide, and also in Viagra, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So Viagra is a vasodilator, and it works by activating nitric oxide in a very specific part of the body. All right, so then here's that term vasomotor again that we get so confused about. Vasomotor refers to the sympathetic regulation of the blood vessels through the vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata. Vasomotor tone, anytime you see the word tone, it's going to be a constant, chronic, but low-level secretion of something or a stimulation of something. So muscle tone, remember, is a chronic, continual stimulation of your muscles. They're always a little bit contracted. Vagal tone of the heart is constant, chronic, continual stimulation by the vagus nerves, which continually keeps your heart at rest at about 70 beats per minute. Vasomotor tone is a continuous stimulation of sympathetic vasoconstrictor nerves so that your arteries, your systemic arteries, are almost always constricted about halfway. And if a person's vasomotor center is killed by whiplash injury, death by hanging works this way, anything that snaps the neck back can kill the vasomotor center. It makes all of the blood vessels completely dilate, and the blood pressure will plummet like a rock, and that person's going to die from a neural shock, a vascular shock. Their blood vessels are all dilated, the blood's going to quit flowing because they have no blood pressure in the arteries anymore. So vasomotor tone, absolutely crucial to life. So we're going to look at the reflex control of cardiovascular function. This was assigned in your essay. This is like the heart of your essay, to explain particularly the baroreceptor reflexes, but also to mention the chemoreceptor reflexes, and then also to include a little bit on the hormones, which we'll talk about after we talk about neural regulation. So with the baroreceptor reflexes, baro refers to barometer, which is a pressure receptor. So baroreceptors are basically little stretch receptors that respond to blood pressure. When blood pressure is high, it stretches the artery wall more, and that stimulates the baroreceptors. If the blood pressure is low, the artery wall is stretched less, and that stimulates the baroreceptors less. Chemoreceptors are going to respond to chemicals, and particularly to a drop in pH, which is almost always going to correlate with a rise in CO2. And so that's the big two things chemoreceptors respond to: high CO2, which correlates with low pH. And then tangentially, chemoreceptors can respond to low oxygen, that's hypoxia, but only when it gets really low. And we'll worry about the chemoreceptors more when we get to the respiratory system. So let's talk about our baroreceptors. You need to know there are two sets of them. It's two sets of these stretch receptors. In the carotid sinuses, we are talking about right up at the base of your jaw, where the common carotid arteries divide into external and internal carotid arteries. The internal carotids supply the brain. So the carotid sinuses sit in the vicinity of that connection. And if the blood pressure to the brain gets too high, well, it could cause an aneurysm to burst. You could have a hemorrhage in the brain. So you don't want the blood pressure to spike, but if the blood pressure gets too low, then that could cause you to pass out. So the carotid sinuses are specifically monitoring blood flow to the brain, sufficient blood pressure in the arterial supply to the brain. The aortic sinuses are right there at the aortic arch, and so they're monitoring the blood pressure to the entire systemic circulation. The right atrium also has some baroreceptors, but it's going to have the opposite effect because the right atrium is at the beginning of the cardiac circuit. It's at the end of the systemic pathway. So the pressure in the right atrium should always be low. If the pressure in the right atrium rises, that usually means you're sending more blood back to the heart. And if you're sending more blood back to the heart, then that means increased venous return. And that's usually associated with an increase in exercise or some kind of stress. And generally what that means is you need to pump more blood out. So in the right atrial reflex, the response is to stimulate the heart. And in the carotid and aortic, if the pressure goes higher there, then through negative feedback, you want to bring it back down. All right, so we're going to have all these reflexes that we're going to take a quick look at. So if blood pressure rises, the cardiovascular centers through negative feedback are going to try to bring it down again. And that's going to be by decreasing cardiac output and vasodilation. If blood pressure falls too low, then the cardiovascular centers are going to boost cardiac output and cause peripheral vasoconstriction. So that much should be obvious. So we'll look at the specific details of our three baroreceptor reflexes. The first one in the right atrium, remember that one's measuring at the end of the systemic circuit. That's the blood coming back through all those veins, the superior and inferior vena cava and all their branches, into the right atrium. This is called the right atrial reflex or the Bainbridge reflex. And in this reflex, what you're going to see is the, that's not a picture of that. What you're going to see is that increase in stimulation of the heart to increase the blood flow. All right, this is a picture of the aortic and carotid reflexes. And so the baroreceptors in the aortic sinus and the carotid sinuses, right and left, when they're stimulated, tell the cardioinhibitory center to slow the heart down, tell the cardioacceleratory center just not to do anything, and tell the vasomotor center to vasodilate, again, by inhibiting it, and so the blood pressure is going to drop. When the baroreceptor and carotid sinuses send the signal that the blood pressure is too low, then that inhibits the baroreceptors, which the effect of that on the cardiac centers in the medulla is to stimulate the vasomotor center and stimulate the cardioacceleratory and inhibit the cardioinhibitory. And so you get vasoconstriction and increased cardiac output, which both raise the blood pressure. Go through this more slowly as you need to. Make sure it makes sense to you. These are negative feedback responses. Okay, briefly, the chemoreceptor reflexes are in little patches of cells, little chemosensitive cells that are very near to the aortic and carotid sinuses, and they're called the aortic and carotid bodies. And so they're going to respond to changes in pH, CO2, and maybe oxygen. There's also central chemoreceptors. We'll worry about these when we get to the respiratory center. So don't worry about those any more than that, just to know that they exist. And that, of course, their main effect is if your pH is low and your CO2 is high, you need to breathe more. And in parallel with breathing more, you need to send more blood to the lungs. So you're going to boost the blood pressure. As a consequence of that, that's going to increase blood flow to the lungs, and that's going to have the negative feedback effect of lowering CO2 and thereby raising pH and oxygen. Okay, so other things that can affect your cardiovascular center, mood can do it, emotional responses can do it. Most of those are mediated through the limbic system of the brain and through the hypothalamus. And so you're going to have, for example, when you get mad, your blood pressure gets elevated. That's all interesting, but not as important as the feedback mechanisms. All right, so those are the neural mechanisms. Talking next about the endocrine mechanisms. Hormones have short term, which is a matter of minutes, or long term, which can be a matter of hours, effects on cardiovascular. So of primary short term importance, epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medullae stimulate cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction. This is part of the sympathetic response, and you learned that when you studied the autonomic nervous system last semester, so that's nothing really new. Here are some things that you may have learned when you studied endocrine. If not, you need to reinforce them now. There are hormones secreted by other body organs besides the adrenal medulla that are going to affect not just vasoconstriction and vasodilation, but they're also going to have a renal effect. That means they're going to tell the kidneys. So antidiuretic hormone, which comes from the posterior pituitary under the control of the hypothalamus, has a major effect of stimulating the kidneys to conserve water, that is, not to lose water in the urine. So urine output falls and blood volume is maintained. So it's going to be a response to low blood volume, high plasma osmotic concentration, which occurs when you're dehydrated, and some other things, other circulating hormones, which we'll get to. What this slide doesn't tell you is that response of ADH actually occurs in the hypothalamus. There are centers in the hypothalamus that respond to dehydration or loss of blood volume, and that center is the one that stimulates the secretion of ADH from the posterior pituitary. So the main effect of ADH is at the kidneys, but ADH at higher levels can also actually cause vasoconstriction in and of itself. Now, a second hormone is called angiotensin. This is really complicated. Angiotensin is regulated by the kidneys. Now, this is a different regulation of the kidneys. This has nothing to do with urine output directly. It's a response of the kidneys to low blood flow. So if you reduce blood flow to the kidneys themselves, they secrete an enzyme called renin, R-E-N-I-N, which stimulates the activation of angiotensin. And angiotensin has two phases, 1 and 2, and angiotensin 2 is the active phase. And angiotensin 2 has all these effects listed here. It stimulates the secretion of aldosterone. It stimulates the secretion of ADH. It stimulates very powerfully a thirst mechanism, makes you just want to go drink some water. And it's a vasoconstrictor. And that's the main thing that angiotensin 2 actually does. It's a very powerful vasoconstrictor, but it doesn't last very long. Okay, another hormone from the kidneys, erythropoietin, which we learned about when we studied the blood, really isn't regulating blood pressure. What it's doing is it's affecting blood pressure because it stimulates the production of red blood cells, which we know affect blood viscosity. So it's, according to your author, it stimulates vasoconstriction. That role is probably minor. All right, so you have all these things going on. You have the stimulus of low blood pressure, giving you short-term effects and long-term effects, the short-term effects through the baroreceptors and the long-term effects by the kidneys, mostly by the kidneys secreting renin, leading to angiotensin 2 activation, which stimulates the secretion of aldosterone, which causes the kidneys to conserve water. Also by thirst stimulation, all of those are going to affect blood volume. And then also because angiotensin is a very powerful vasoconstrictor. We're going to look at this in more detail when we get to the balances chapter, which we won't do until we study the kidneys. All right, now there's some opposing hormones, the natriuretic peptides. Natrium refers to sodium, so these things, ANP and BNP, are, strictly speaking, named for their effect on aldosterone. Aldosterone tells the kidneys to keep sodium and therefore to keep water. Natriuretic peptides tell the kidneys to dump sodium and therefore to dump water. So ANP and BNP are going to block the effects of aldosterone, and they also block the effects of ADH, and so they're going to reduce blood volume And they're also going to, it turns out, vasodilate by blocking the effects of ADH on vasoconstriction. So here's the opposite then. When the stimulus is blood pressure is high, and typically that's because of high blood volume, then the heart responds to this excess blood volume, causing it to chronically stretch by secreting these hormones ANP and BNP, which then tell the kidneys to dump sodium and water. That lowers the blood volume and also helps to peripherally vasodilate the vessels, and all of that's going to lower the blood pressure. All right, so that's the end of part 2. We'll pick up with part 3 next.